Hello, friends. Settle in, slow your breathing, and allow the quiet to surround you, because tonight's account is not an easy one to hear. I still struggle to believe it myself. I had lived in this region since the autumn of 1889, and never once had our county been marked by a crime of such magnitude. This was a place known for routine, for lanterns glowing softly at dusk, for doors left unlocked out of habit rather than carelessness. The idea that an entire household could be wiped out overnight felt impossible, until it wasn't. On a still June morning in 1894, that illusion of safety collapsed in the farming settlement of Red Willow, Missouri. News moved slowly then, carried by whispers and hurried footsteps rather than headlines. By midday, the town seemed frozen, unable to understand how such brutality could surface in a place defined by familiarity and trust. What unsettled people most was not only the crime itself, but who was believed to be responsible. Neighbors spoke in disbelief. One woman recalled how her son used to sit on the front steps of the Hawthorne home, carving shapes into the dirt with the younger children, racing wooden hoops along the road. Those memories now felt distorted, as though they belonged to another lifetime altogether. Only the evening before, nothing about Hawthorne Lane suggested tragedy. The house stood neatly kept, its oil lamps trimmed, its windows open to the summer air. Church bells had marked the approaching Sunday, and families were preparing for a modest day of rest. Eleanor Hawthorne, 58, was the quiet center of that home, known for her steady presence and unyielding sense of duty. Her husband, Samuel Hawthorne, 66, had raised Eleanor's daughter as his own, earning a reputation as a patient and dependable man. Their daughter, Clara Wells, 31, had arrived days earlier with her 2 young children, hoping to spend a peaceful weekend under their parents' roof. No one ever speaks about how ordinary the final hours are before everything breaks apart. The final kettle Samuel placed over the stove, the final hymn Eleanor hummed while folding linens, the moment Clara guided her children into the spare bedroom, promising them warm bread and honey in the morning. Moments so small they seemed meaningless until they became the last ones that mattered. What remains hardest to understand is what followed. Sometime during the night, Thomas Wells, Clara's older brother, made a decision from which there could be no return. At 35 years of age, he traveled roads he had walked since childhood, carrying with him a resolve shaped by years of quiet instability. Court ledgers from 1891 would later reveal prior confinements, notes of troubling behavior that had never fully been addressed. By dawn, those unresolved struggles erupted. Shortly after sunrise, a relative arrived at the Hawthorne residence, perhaps to check in before church, perhaps sensing something was wrong. When the door was opened, there was no greeting, no familiar morning movement, only a dense, unnatural stillness that pressed against the senses. A cry for help followed, panicked, broken, impossible to forget. Local constables arrived swiftly. What they encountered inside the home would haunt them for years to come. Eleanor Hawthorne was found lifeless. Samuel Hawthorne lay nearby. Clara Wells, a young mother whose children slept just rooms away, was also gone. The children were discovered together. alive, untouched physically, but forever changed by what they had been unknowingly close to. How does a community explain such loss? How do you tell a child that the people who loved them most will never speak again? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how could someone so closely bound to that family become the force that destroyed it?
The constables who arrived that morning were men accustomed to hardship. They had faced accidents, brawls, and death before, but nothing prepared them for what followed. Trained to enforce the law, they suddenly found themselves doing something far more fragile, comforting children whose understanding of safety had been torn away in a single night. Blankets were wrapped around small shoulders. Gentle voices replaced firm commands. Inside the Hawthorne home, the evidence told a confusing story. Some officers reported no obvious signs of forced entry. The doors were intact, the locks undamaged. That detail suggested the person responsible had been known, someone who did not need to break their way inside. Yet other investigators pointed to overturned furniture and disturbed belongings, signs that hinted at chaos, perhaps even resistance. So which version was true? The answer mattered more than it seemed, because it shaped the final moments inside that house, whether they unfolded quietly or violently or somewhere in between. As the investigation deepened, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. This was not a crime of chance. Whoever carried it out understood the home intimately. They knew which rooms were occupied. They knew the routines. They knew 3 children were present and made a deliberate decision to leave them alive. That was not confusion. That was intention. Within 8 hours of the discovery, suspicion narrowed to one name: Thomas Wells. He was located just streets away, seated inside his horse-drawn wagon along Maple Cross Road, not attempting to flee, not concealing himself. He had remained close, as if distance no longer mattered. There was no resistance when constables approached, no desperate attempt to escape justice. The arrest was quiet, unsettlingly so. No shouting, no struggle, just a man stepping down slowly, hands visible, eyes hollow. The same hands that ended 3 lives were raised in surrender without a word spoken. But no arrest could repair what had been broken. Why would a son destroy the woman who raised him? Why would a brother take his sister's life while her children slept unawares just beyond the walls? What kind of darkness grows silently for years before finally demanding release? Red Willow was changed forever. Neighbors who once lingered on porches after sunset now barred their doors before nightfall. Children were called indoors earlier. Conversations grew hushed, wary. Trust, once given freely, became something fragile and guarded. And amid the shock, the grief, and the fear, a small fund was organized through church collections and handwritten pledges meant to support the children left behind. Coins dropped quietly into wooden boxes. No speeches, no explanations, just an unspoken agreement that innocence, once wounded, should not be abandoned. Because while the Hawthorne home would never again feel alive, the town understood one thing clearly: the living still had to be protected.
Emerged. It was the town's quiet answer to grief. Not speeches, not spectacle, just small acts of care offered when the weight of loss felt too heavy to name. Clergy members gathered discreet donations. Shopkeepers set aside modest sums without announcement. It was help given softly, shaped by shared disbelief rather than obligation. By nightfall, word traveled beyond Red Willow's borders. Regional notices confirmed that an arrest had been made in connection with the Hawthorne household deaths. Officials stated that the accused had taken the lives of both parents and his sister within their own home. A bond was imposed, an overwhelming amount for the era, less an opportunity for release, more a public acknowledgement of the gravity involved. Yet money could not repair what had been destroyed. 3 lives erased in a single morning, children left without a mother, a community forced to confront the fragility of its sense of safety. People searched backward through memory, replaying conversations, glances, silences, anything that might explain how warning signs had slipped past unnoticed. One uneasy thought echoed through homes and storefronts alike. Do we ever truly know those closest to us? That same afternoon, while kitchens across the county filled with the smell of Sunday meals, Thomas Wells remained along Maple Cross Road, seated where he had stopped hours earlier. His wagon had not moved. The horse stood patiently, reins slack. He made no effort to disappear. Investigators would later struggle to interpret that stillness. Acceptance, emotional collapse, or the quiet certainty that there was nowhere left to go. Reports arrived steadily. Several residents remembered seeing Wells pass through the area earlier that day. Nothing overt, nothing alarming enough to provoke action. Only afterward did that silence feel unbearable. How many times do people sense unease and choose comfort over caution? How many lives depend on instincts taken seriously? The inquiry progressed slowly, grounded in reality rather than drama. No clear narratives, no instant conclusions. Investigators relied on written testimony, imperfect recollections, and timelines constructed from fragments. Gradually, the outline of events formed, but one truth remained out of reach. Motive. Authorities were deliberate in their statements. This was not a random act. Familiarity alone ruled that out, but beyond that, certainty dissolved. Rage, long-held resentment, a mind fractured over years rather than moments. Court archives revealed earlier confinements, periods when Wells's behavior had alarmed those closest to him, though understanding and resources were limited. Whether those unresolved struggles had returned with catastrophic force remained uncertain. Post-mortem findings confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Each death reflected control, precision, separation. This was not chaos unleashed, it was intent carried through. Several details were sealed, withheld from public discussion, but one fact could not be softened. The children inside the house heard it all. The sounds, the pauses, the moments in between. In the aftermath, caretakers and physicians worked to help them navigate trauma that resisted language. How does a child reconcile love and terror when both wear the same familiar face? Within the county holding facility, Thomas Wells awaited his first appearance before the court. The bond attached to his name was immense, symbolic rather than attainable. Ink on paper, a number assigned to devastation. And soon Red Willow would understand that justice, whatever form it took, would never truly balance what had been lost.
Freedom. No amount set for release could ever resemble the cost of that morning. 3 lives ended, children left without parents, families fractured beyond repair, a town permanently altered. The machinery of justice moved forward without pause. Within hours, 3 counts of murder were formally filed. Officials acted with urgency, aware that the public demanded certainty, structure, something solid to cling to amid the shock. But formal charges, however swift, offered no clarity. Responsibility had a name. Understanding did not. The following day, Thomas Wells was brought before the court for the first time. Dressed plainly, restrained, he bore little resemblance to the man preserved in older family portraits, smiling, present, human. That version seemed distant now, replaced by someone hollow and unresponsive. No statement was offered, no plea entered. He stood in silence as the charges were read aloud, each one carrying the weight of a life taken. The attorney appointed to his defense inherited an impossible task. How does one speak in mitigation when the evidence itself tells a story of intention, when the absence of explanation only deepens the wound? Whatever argument might one day be formed, it would struggle to stand against the reality left behind. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for early August, though few believed the proceedings would hinge on whether the acts occurred. That question had already been answered. The unanswered truth, the one that haunted everyone, remained motive. Outside the courthouse, grief spread quietly through Red Willow. Funds raised to cover burial expenses exceeded expectations within days. Many contributors had never met the Hawthorne family. They gave because they recognized the randomness of it all, how easily the tragedy could have belonged to any household, on any street, during any ordinary Sunday. Evenings brought candlelight vigils. Flames trembled in the summer air as neighbors gathered, heads bowed, voices low. But beneath the prayers, another emotion began to surface: anger, doubt, reflection. Had earlier confinements been warnings missed? Were past struggles signals ignored too easily? Had intervention arrived too late or not at all? As days passed, national attention followed. Journalists unfamiliar with the town's quiet rhythm arrived searching for clarity, for narrative. Conflicting reports emerged. Some claimed there was no forced entry. Others suggested signs of intrusion. Accounts differed on whether Wells had spoken at all. In the absence of official detail, speculation filled the gaps. Months later, much remained unresolved. Examinations continued, records reviewed, statements revisited, financial histories, medical notes, personal correspondence, all scrutinized in hopes of uncovering meaning where there may be none sufficient. But amid investigations and headlines, the true survivors were rarely seen: the children. Their names were withheld, their lives carefully shielded as best as possible. Each night they slept in unfamiliar rooms, in beds that did not carry the comfort of routine. They asked questions that adults could not answer, questions without language, questions without solutions. They will grow older carrying a story they did not choose, one they may someday explain to counselors, to loved ones, perhaps even to their own children. This is the lasting cost of familial violence, not only in those who are lost, but in those who remain, in wounds unseen, in guilt misplaced, in young minds struggling to understand responsibility for events they could never have controlled. For years they may wonder if there was something they missed, something they could have said, something they could have changed. It is a cruel burden, no child should carry. And as the legal process continues, one truth stands unshaken. The full story may one day be recorded in court transcripts and official rulings, but the damage, the kind that lingers quietly, will never be fully measured.
May never be fully understood. Hidden fractures within a family, a troubled mind left untreated, anger that grew quietly, unseen until it burst into a single, irreversible moment. We search desperately for explanations because accepting the idea of meaningless violence is too terrifying. But the hardest truth is this: danger is often invisible until it is far too late. It is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it is someone already inside the home. Sometimes the person who destroys a family is part of that family. Eleanor Hawthorne lived nearly 60 decades. Samuel Hawthorne, more than 60 years. Clara Wells, only 31, her life still unfolding, her future unfinished. They were owed more time, more quiet breakfasts, more ordinary days filled with small, forgettable moments. Instead, 3 children must grow into adulthood carrying absence where love once lived. So what warnings do we ignore because facing them feels unsettling? How many calm Sundays must end in silence before comfort gives way to vigilance? Missouri, like most places, was considered safe, familiar, predictable, but safety is not immunity. History reminds us that even the quietest landscapes can bear witness to unimaginable violence. And not long after Red Willow was marked by tragedy, another case emerged, one that proved something even more unsettling. Because sometimes the threat is not family. Sometimes it is a complete stranger. May never truly be explained. Cracks that formed quietly within a family, a mind struggling without care, emotions buried so deeply that no one noticed their weight until they exploded into a single devastating morning. We search endlessly for reasons because the idea of violence without logic is almost unbearable. Yet the most frightening truth remains this: danger often gives no warning. It is not always a shadow outside the door. It is not always a stranger passing through. Sometimes the threat already lives within the walls. Eleanor Hawthorne lived nearly 60 years. Samuel Hawthorne, more than 60 years. Clara Wells, only 31, her life still unfolding, her future unfinished. They were owed more time, more quiet breakfasts, more ordinary days filled with small, forgettable moments. Instead, 3 children must grow into adulthood carrying absence where love once lived. So what warnings do we ignore because facing them feels unsettling? How many calm Sundays must end in silence before comfort gives way to vigilance? Missouri, like most places, was considered safe, familiar, unremarkable. But safety is not immunity. History reminds us that even the quietest landscapes can bear witness to unimaginable violence. And not long after Red Willow was marked by tragedy, another case emerged, one that proved something even more unsettling. Because sometimes the threat is not family. Sometimes it is a complete stranger.
In the aftermath, officials would later state, "We removed a predator and brought a measure of peace back to 2 young girls." The man they referred to did not fit the image people expected.
He was not wandering. He was not known to police. He was a trusted educator. In the summer of 1897, deep within the wooded expanse of Ravens Hollow Reserve in the Arkansas Territory, a family disappeared during what should have been an ordinary afternoon outdoors. Edwin Clark, 42, and his wife Margaret, 39, had recently settled near Prairie Fork, drawn by the promise of quiet living. Their two daughters, 6 and 8, spent their days exploring trails, laughing freely, untouched by fear. Edwin and Margaret believed time together, fresh air, and simplicity could protect what mattered most. That Saturday began no differently than any other. Ravens Hollow stretched across miles of dense wilderness, stone ridges carved by time, narrow streams cutting through shaded valleys, paths worn smooth by generations of visitors. Old lodges stood among the trees, symbols of rest and refuge. Parents trusted this place. The Clark family felt safe. What they could not see was the presence moving silently among the trees. Andrew Hale, 27, had recently taken a position as a regional schoolmaster. He carried no criminal history, no violent past, no known connection to the Clarks. Yet investigators would later uncover signs of preparation, movements planned, opportunities studied. The attack came suddenly. Edwin was confronted first, given no chance to react, no opportunity to shield those he loved. In the chaos, Margaret managed to pull their daughters away. She could have kept running. She could have vanished into the forest. She didn't. Margaret turned back. That choice ended her life, but it revealed her character completely. Even in terror, her instinct was loyalty, love. The girls were later found nearly half a mile away, physically unharmed, emotionally shattered. Their cries carried through the trees, heard by passing hikers who alerted authorities. When officers arrived, the forest was quiet once more. Only the bodies remained. The attacker had vanished, but the path he left behind would soon guide investigators towards a truth far more disturbing than anyone expected. Because this time, the monster was not hiding behind closed doors. He was living openly, trusted, invisible. May never be fully understood. Silent cracks festered within the Hawthorne family. A mind unheeded, feelings buried so deep that no one could sense the pressure until it erupted in a single, irreversible morning. We search for reasons because the thought of meaningless violence is unbearable, yet the harshest truth persists. Danger often shows no warning. It is not always a shadow at the window. It is not always a stranger at the gate. Sometimes it lives within the very walls meant to protect you. Eleanor Hawthorne had lived nearly 60 years. Samuel Hawthorne surpassed 6 decades. Clara Wells, only 31, barely beginning her life. They deserved more sunrises, more quiet breakfasts, more ordinary days. Instead, 3 children must grow in the shadow of absence, learning the weight of love they once had. Which signs do we ignore because facing them feels too painful?
How many peaceful Sundays must end in silence before caution replaces comfort? Missouri, like many places, was thought safe, familiar, ordinary, but safety is never a guarantee. Even the quietest ground can carry the echoes of devastation. And soon after Red Willow, another tragedy emerged, one even more unsettling. Because sometimes the threat is not family. Sometimes it is a stranger who walks openly among us. Story 2. The Stranger in Plain Sight. Authorities would later state, "We removed a predator and returned some measure of safety to 2 young girls." The man they referred to did not fit expectations. He was not wandering. He was not known to the law. He was a respected teacher. In the summer of 1897, deep within the forests of Ravens Hollow Reserve, Arkansas Territory, a family vanished during what should have been an ordinary afternoon outdoors. Edwin Clark, 42, and Margaret Clark, 39, had recently settled near Prairie Fork, seeking calm and simplicity. Their daughters, ages 6 and 8, spent the morning exploring trails, laughing freely, unaware of the shadow approaching. Edwin and Margaret believed shared time outdoors could shield their children from the world's dangers. That Saturday began like any other. Ravens Hollow stretched for miles, limestone cliffs, narrow streams, forest paths worn by generations. Rustic lodges dotted the landscape. Parents trusted this place. The Clarks felt safe. What they could not know was the presence moving silently among the trees. Andrew Hale, 27, newly appointed as a regional schoolmaster, had no criminal history, no record of violence, and no connection to the family. Yet, investigators would later uncover signs of meticulous planning, movements studied, opportunities calculated. The attack came swiftly. Edwin was struck first, offered no chance to defend those he loved. In the chaos, Margaret managed to pull their daughters to safety. She could have fled entirely, vanished into the forest. She did not. Margaret turned back. Her choice cost her life, but revealed the depth of her character. Even in the face of terror, her instinct was loyalty, love, protection. The girls were discovered nearly half a mile away, physically unharmed but shaken to their core. Their cries carried through the trees, reaching passing hikers who alerted authorities in time. When officers arrived, the forest was silent again. Only the bodies remained. The attacker had vanished, but the trail he left would soon expose a truth more chilling than anyone could imagine. This time, the monster was not hiding in a home. He lived openly, trusted, invisible.
May never be fully understood. Investigators began revisiting an older homicide, one eerily similar to the attack on the Clark family, so unsettling that it could not easily be dismissed as coincidence. Nearly 5 years earlier, in the fall of 1892, a lone hiker had been murdered under circumstances that mirrored the later tragedy in Arkansas. On October 12, 1892, Henry Carter, 24, set out for a morning walk along the rugged trails of Shadow Lake Park in northern Wisconsin Territory. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind that draws crowds eager to see the fiery reds and golds scattered across cliffs and wooded valleys. Shadow Lake Park was one of the busiest destinations in the region, sprawling across more than 8,500 acres of rocky ridges, dense forest, and winding paths carved by decades of visitors. That morning, families and tourists filled the trails, yet somewhere along Grotto Trail, Henry encountered a man with dangerous intent. At 11:42 a.m., he was attacked and fatally wounded by a knife. The assault happened in broad daylight, with dozens nearby. Witnesses would later describe seeing a man fleeing the scene, a white male, roughly 6 feet tall, slim build, wearing dark trousers with worn knees, a jacket or tunic, moving in a frenzied, almost stumbling way. No clear image of him was captured. DNA and forensic traces were collected, but no suspect was ever identified, and the case slowly went cold. Decades later, with Andrew Hale in custody in Arkansas, authorities in Ashwood County reopened the files. They began comparing the Wisconsin homicide with the Clark family murders. The similarities were striking. Both occurred in state-managed parks with ominous names. Both involved sudden, violent attacks in daylight. Both used knives, and in both cases, the perpetrator vanished without a trace. Wisconsin investigators began re-examining the evidence alongside items collected in Arkansas, including blood traces and objects from Hale's home and belongings. Testing continues, and no official match has yet been confirmed. For Henry Carter's family, the renewed investigation offers a fragile glimmer of hope that answers may finally arrive. For law enforcement, it raises a chilling possibility. Hale's alleged violence may not have begun in Arkansas, but years earlier, far to the north. When neighbors and former acquaintances reflect on his past, some now see signs they missed at the time. One childhood neighbor recalled, "Sometimes he was perfectly normal, and then, if provoked even slightly, he would completely lose control, just snap." Hale grew up in Illinois, in a quiet suburb southwest of Chicago, known to friends as Andy. As a boy, he played baseball, roamed the streets with friends, and received coaching from his father. From the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary childhood. Yet, in hindsight, former friends remember flashes of sudden anger and intensity they could not understand. By 1896, Hale had already worked in multiple school districts across 3 states, Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Such frequent turnover was rare in teaching, a profession where instructors often remained at the same school for many years. Even for investigators, piecing together his history proved difficult. At the time of his arrest, officials initially misreported his name as Andrew James Hale, before later correcting records. Some documents even indicated a connection to Oklahoma Territorial College, yet deeper investigation traced his origins back to Illinois. This pattern reinforced the sense that Hale had spent years slipping through gaps in oversight, reshaping his identity as he moved from one place to another. When former classmates and neighbors first saw his mugshot in the headlines, the shock was profound. For those who remembered him as a quiet, ordinary boy, the reality of what he had allegedly done was almost impossible to reconcile.
Unreal. The boy once known as Andy was now accused of murdering Edwin and Margaret Clark, and investigators were exploring potential links to 2 other violent crimes across distant states. Nothing has been officially confirmed yet, but authorities are piecing together a larger puzzle, hoping he may be the missing link in cold cases that have haunted families for years. For loved ones in Wisconsin and Illinois, the possibility of answers brings a fragile sense of hope that justice could still be served. Meanwhile, Andrew Hale remains held at Washington County Detention Center, facing 2 counts of capital murder. Prosecutor Samuel Bennett has announced plans to seek the death penalty. That decision guarantees a lengthy legal battle, with hearings, motions, and appeals likely stretching over a decade. As attorneys argue in courtrooms, 2 young girls are trying to survive a world without their parents. Only 7 and 9 years old, they now live with relatives, surrounded by care, yet far too young to understand why their mother and father will never return. In court, Hale entered a plea of not guilty, directly contradicting reports from police sources claiming he confessed after his arrest. Behind closed doors, investigators say he admitted to killing Edwin and Margaret Clark. Publicly, before cameras, journalists, and grieving family members, he denied all responsibility. That contradiction set the stage for a trial expected to be lengthy, complicated, and emotionally devastating for the Clark family and for a community still struggling to comprehend the events. The Clark case resonated so deeply because, by all accounts, they had done everything right. They chose a safe, family-oriented park. They stayed together. They lived quietly in Prairie Fork, focused on creating a stable life for their daughters. Edwin had recently secured reliable work as a courier, while Margaret devoted herself to raising the girls. They owed no one, carried no hidden conflicts, yet none of it protected them when fate crossed their path with a predator. Investigators quickly determined this was not an impulsive act of rage. Hale had chosen his location deliberately, an isolated stretch of trail where cell service vanished, dense woods could muffle screams, and multiple escape routes ensured a swift getaway. The positioning of the victims, the precision of the wounds, and even the dark covering over his carriage's license plate all indicated careful planning. This was not chaos. This was pursuit. Forensic findings revealed the desperate resistance of Edwin and Margaret. Edwin had managed to strike Hale, leaving behind blood that ultimately identified him. Margaret had pushed her daughters toward safety, then turned back to aid her husband, sacrificing her life in the process. Their courage created the evidence that exposed Hale's constructed normalcy, revealing the monster beneath. Within 2 days, the Arkansas State Police released a composite sketch and photograph of the suspect. The image spread rapidly, generating thousands of tips. Surveillance showed a suspicious carriage near the park multiple times, even weeks before the killings. Witnesses reported seeing a man with blood on his face fleeing in a dark vehicle. Piece by piece, investigators assembled the timeline. On July 30th, only 4 days after the murders, the search ended quietly in a barber shop. Police surrounded Hale less than 5 minutes into his haircut. He remained calm, detached, and did not resist. Confronted with DNA accounts, witness accounts, and video footage, he confessed. Detectives later described his admission as disturbingly flat. No explanation, no visible remorse, no emotion. That emptiness unsettled investigators more than any act of violence ever could. Yet the most disturbing revelation wasn't solely about Hale himself. It was what his history suggested, a pattern of violence
carefully hidden, waiting years for opportunity.
The case revealed the limits of existing safety systems. Andrew Hale had no criminal record, no documented history of violence, and no obvious warning signs to flag him as a potential threat. He passed every background check and blended seamlessly with colleagues and neighbors. If someone like him could conceal such lethal intent, how many others might be doing the same? That question weighed heavily over investigators, law enforcement, and the community alike. Random acts of violence are often assumed to come from individuals whose instability is visible and predictable. Hale shattered that assumption. He proved that someone could appear ordinary, even trustworthy, while secretly plotting destruction. That outward respectability masked lethal intent, showing that danger could hide in society's most trusted roles. The implications went far beyond law enforcement, reaching into education policy itself. How rigorously are schools vetting potential hires? Are psychological evaluations capable of detecting someone harboring violent tendencies? Even if nothing could have saved the Clark family, could stronger safeguards have kept Hale from ever being placed near children? These questions mattered because Hale represented a terrifying type of threat, the unseen predator who strikes without warning, without motive, and without a discernible pattern. Traditional safety measures are designed to catch criminals driven by logic or opportunity, robbers seeking cash, or someone committing violence for revenge or gain. They are not built to anticipate an attacker who murders a family for reasons he cannot or will not explain. As Hale awaits trial, set for November 12, 1897, the legal process is only beginning, and it may last decades. On average, cases involving the death penalty stretch over 15 years from sentencing to resolution. That means the Clark daughters could grow up, marry, and have children of their own before this chapter is truly closed. That reality forces agonizing questions about justice and healing. Does a prolonged legal battle honor Edwin and Margaret Clark's memory? Does the death penalty bring closure or merely prolong trauma? There are no easy answers, only questions their family must live with. Raven's Hollow Reserve has already been irreversibly altered. Trails once associated with peace, nature, and family outings are now forever tied to violence and grief. Families who once visited without hesitation now wonder if any public space can ever be truly safe. Hale didn't just destroy one family, he fractured an entire community's sense of security. Yet the most powerful lesson in this tragedy isn't about his capacity for violence, it's about Edwin and Margaret Clark's capacity for love. In the face of unimaginable terror, they chose each other and their children. That decision, not Hale's brutality, is what should define this story. Hale's motives may never be fully understood. He may carry those answers with him for life, leaving investigators and the public to speculate endlessly. But the Clarks' character has already been revealed through their final actions. They were parents who became heroes in their last moments, sacrificing everything to protect the ones they loved most. As the case moves toward trial, it forces everyone to confront a difficult truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Predators don't always look the way we expect. Safety is never absolute, no matter how carefully we choose our surroundings or plan our days. And yet this story also shows something stronger than fear, the capacity of ordinary people to show extraordinary courage when it matters most. Edwin and Margaret Clark weren't trained to fight. They weren't prepared for violence. They were simply parents who refused to surrender without protecting their children. Their bravery created the very evidence that revealed the truth. Their love became the final act of defiance against a darkness that sought to destroy them.
The Clark daughters will grow up without their parents, but they will also grow up knowing that their mother and father's final act was one of love, courage, and sacrifice. That legacy, painful though it is, carries far more weight than any act of violence could ever erase. What does justice truly look like in such a case? Is the death penalty necessary, or does life behind bars better uphold justice for those left behind? Story 3. Between the mid-1970s and late 1980s, fear quietly crept into suburban homes across the United States. Parents anxiously inspected Halloween candy, terrified that something deadly might be hidden within. True crime enthusiasts often know the nickname that emerged from that era, the Candyman. Images and stories circulate on old crime forums and in documentary footage, but few understand the full scope of his crimes. The story began with what seemed like an ordinary Halloween, yet it spiraled into one of the most chilling domestic cases in American history. Martin Callahan was born on October 19, 1944, in Austin, Texas, into what appeared to be a normal household. Childhood memories reflected a polite, quiet, and unremarkable boy. By adulthood, Martin had built a life that, from the outside, seemed stable and respectable. He married Deborah Callahan, and together they raised 2 children, Stephen and Lydia. To neighbors and friends, the family epitomized suburban normalcy, a devoted Christian household in the quiet middle-class enclave of Oakwood, Texas, just outside Austin. Martin sang in the church choir, worked as an optician, maintained a pristine lawn, greeted neighbors with a smile, and volunteered actively in the community. Yet beneath the veneer of respectability, cracks were forming. His career was unstable. Over the decade of the early 1970s, Martin cycled through jobs, repeatedly losing positions due to carelessness, dishonesty, and poor work habits. Each termination was followed by a brief period of employment elsewhere, but none endured. Supervisors called him unreliable, inconsistent, and obsessively focused on money. Despite working in a field with consistent demand, he never found lasting success. Deborah took on part-time work to supplement the family income, but their financial troubles deepened. Martin borrowed from banks, lenders, and even his own father. By 1974, he was reportedly over $100,000 in debt, a massive sum for the time. Yet outwardly, he appeared composed, devout, and unshakable. He taught Sunday school, remained polite, well-dressed, and present at church services. Behind that facade, however, a dangerous shift was occurring. Martin increasingly viewed his family not as loved ones, but as tools to escape his financial ruin, a mindset that would culminate in devastating consequences. In early 1974, Martin began quietly purchasing life insurance policies on his children. Initially modest, $1,000 each, these amounts grew steadily. By October, only weeks before Halloween, 8-year-old Stephen alone was insured for $60,000. When questioned by authorities later, Martin claimed these policies were intended solely to protect his family financially. Prosecutors, however, would later paint a more sinister picture. Martin was methodically laying the groundwork for something far more sinister. The payout he had planned would be tied to his own child's life.
the evening of October 31st, 1974, the Callahan family visited their neighbors, the Harringtons, at their home in Pasadena, Texas. It was a familiar social ritual, one the families had practiced for years. Stephen, 8, and Lydia, 5, could hardly contain their excitement, eager to begin trick-or-treating. The plan was simple. After dinner, Martin Callahan and Robert Harrington would take the children around the neighborhood while their wives stayed behind to hand out candy. At the time, nothing seemed unusual about the arrangement. But what would later stand out to investigators was Martin's behavior that night. Normally indifferent to Halloween, rarely decorating, never dressing up, and generally dismissing the holiday, Martin now appeared uncharacteristically enthusiastic, even volunteering to escort the children door to door. Friends and neighbors would later recall this sudden cheerfulness as completely out of character. As the group moved through the calm, tree-lined streets, the night seemed ordinary. Cool air drifted across the sidewalks. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed on porches, and children in costumes darted between houses, laughter filling the evening. Robert Harrington walked beside Martin, chatting casually, while the children ran ahead, candy buckets slowly filling. Then they approached a dark brick home on a quiet corner lot, its porch empty and lights off. The children knocked, waited, and returned disappointed. Ordinarily, no response meant no candy, but then Martin suddenly stopped the group. He told everyone to wait while he tried the door one last time. According to Robert Harrington, Martin walked up the walkway alone and disappeared near the front entrance. Minutes passed and the children fidgeted, unaware of anything amiss. Robert began to wonder what was taking so long. Eventually, Martin returned, carrying 5 long pixie sticks, their bright paper tubes filled with sugary powder. With a smile, Martin claimed someone had finally answered the door at the last moment. "Lucky us," he said, handing them out. 1 to Stephen, 1 to Lydia, 2 to the Harrington children, and keeping the 5th for a boy from church, Elliot Parker. No one questioned him. It was Halloween after all, and the candy appeared unopened and safe. Martin's reputation as a polite church-going father made him the least likely person anyone would suspect. Later, after trick-or-treating, the Callahans returned home. A light rain tapped softly against the roof as the children emptied their candy across the living room floor. Stephen, still wearing his astronaut costume, asked his father for one last treat before bedtime. Martin complied, handing him the same pixie stick he had kept aside, the one that would later make the events of that night horrifically infamous.
The candy he had kept aside, the one from the darkened house earlier that evening, was the one Stephen tried to open. The top was sealed too tightly, and no sugar flowed at first. Martin Callahan leaned over, carefully helping him tear it open, rolling the paper tube between his fingers to loosen the contents. Stephen poured a small amount into his mouth and immediately grimaced. "It tastes strange," he said. Martin suggested rinsing with water to wash it down. Stephen complied, but within moments his discomfort became unmistakable. He clutched his stomach, complaining of sharp pain. Then vomiting began. His tiny body convulsed as Martin awkwardly tried to keep him upright. A neighbor heard the commotion and called for emergency help, but the situation was already beyond saving.
Within minutes, Stephen's breathing slowed, then ceased entirely. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. 8-year-old Stephen Callahan was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital. The time of death was traced to just under an hour after consuming the poisoned candy. News spread through the community like wildfire. Panic swept over Pasadena. Parents emptied candy buckets, fearful that more poisoned treats lurked inside. Police officers and firefighters canvassed neighborhoods collecting candy, while radio and television interrupted regular programming to urgently warn families, do not let children consume Halloween candy from unknown sources. Skepticism ran high at first. Poisoned Halloween candy seemed like an urban legend, a cautionary tale from campfires or horror films. Laboratory testing, however, eliminated any doubt. Toxicology revealed that the pixie stick Stephen had eaten contained potassium cyanide, a lethal poison capable of killing within minutes. The amount hidden in that single candy could have killed multiple adults. Detectives quickly located the remaining 4 pixie sticks Martin had handed out. Remarkably, none of the other children had consumed theirs. One parent recounted a chilling detail. A child had attempted to eat the candy before bed, but couldn't open the tightly stapled tube. Frustrated, the child gave up and went to sleep, the candy clutched in hand, an accident that ultimately saved their life. The investigation zeroed in immediately on responsibility. Officers retraced the Callahans' trick-or-treat route, knocking on doors, interviewing homeowners, and reconstructing the night. When they reached the house Martin had described, the dark, unlit home, one crucial fact emerged. The homeowner, Curtis Melvin, hadn't been home. He had been working a late shift at the airport until 11 p.m., confirmed by over 200 colleagues. That single detail unraveled Martin's story. When questioned again, Martin's account faltered. He couldn't consistently recall which houses the children had visited. Each time detectives pressed for clarification, his answers conflicted. Police also confirmed that no other children in the neighborhood had received pixie sticks from any house that night, except the ones Martin had handed out himself. At that point, attention shifted to Martin's personal life. Investigators discovered a staggering financial strain. He was over $100,000 in debt, a massive sum in 1974, hidden carefully from those around him. The pieces of the puzzle began to suggest a motive far darker than anyone had imagined.
He was behind on loan payments, drowning in overdue bills, and facing the looming threat of losing his car. His mortgage was in arrears, and even his regular contributions to the local church had stopped. On paper, Stephen Callahan appeared to be a man collapsing under financial strain. What truly alarmed detectives, however, were the life insurance policies. Earlier that year, Stephen had purchased multiple policies on both of his children. Once the timeline was reconstructed, it became horrifyingly clear this was no accident. The first policy, valued at $10,000, was taken out in January 1974. A second followed quietly in the spring. Then, just days before Halloween, he signed a third and final policy, once again naming himself as the sole beneficiary. Each policy would pay out directly to Stephen in the event of either child's death. When investigators compared these figures to his crushing debts, the motive became impossible to ignore. This was not about protecting the family. It was about collecting money.
In total, the policies amounted to roughly $60,000, a staggering sum for 1974. Adjusted for today's dollars, that would be somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000, a sum large enough to erase a major portion of his financial troubles. When confronted, Stephen insisted it was responsible planning, but the timeline told a very different story. Investigators also discovered that he had recently visited a local chemical supply store, asking pointed questions about potassium cyanide, how to buy it, how to handle it safely, and what quantities were available. The store employee later recalled the conversation, noting that Stephen left visibly irritated when informed the smallest available amount cost £5. At that moment, detectives realized the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The poisoned candy had not come from some stranger. It had come from inside Stephen Callahan's own home. On November 5, 1974, just 5 days after young Stephen's funeral, police quietly moved in. They arrested Stephen Callahan on charges of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. By the time the officers left, the entire neighborhood had grasped the horror of what had just occurred. The man who once sang in the front row of his church choir, led prayers with his family, and appeared perfectly ordinary to friends and neighbors, had revealed a darkness no one could have imagined.
Every Sunday, Stephen Callahan now faced accusations of murdering his own child for financial gain. During questioning, he denied all responsibility, insisting some unknown person must have tampered with the candy, and claiming he too was an innocent victim. But the evidence told a very different story. His financial motive was unmistakable. His story about the dark house had completely fallen apart, and no other families in Hawthorne Springs reported receiving pixie sticks that Halloween. When Stephen Callahan's trial began in May 1975, national attention followed closely. From the outset, prosecutors made one thing clear: this case was driven by money. They painstakingly detailed his financial collapse: overdue loans, mounting credit card debt, repossession threats, and a car on the verge of being taken away. Jurors learned how Stephen had purchased multiple life insurance policies on his children, totaling $60,000, and how he had called the insurance company the morning after young Ethan's death to ask when the payout would be issued. That phone call shattered any appearance of genuine grief. Prosecutors then presented testimony showing that in the weeks leading up to Halloween, Stephen had asked several acquaintances about cyanide. One co-worker testified that Stephen had inquired what amount would be enough to kill someone. Another recalled him saying he had heard cyanide acted quickly and was difficult to trace in small quantities. Forensic evidence sealed the case. Tests confirmed that the pixie stick Ethan consumed contained potassium cyanide. Experts explained that the top portion of the candy had been removed, replaced with poison, and resealed using metal staples, identical to those used at Stephen's workplace at the optical supply store. Every detail pointed to a single conclusion: deliberate, premeditated murder. Investigators also called the insurance agent who handled the final policy on Ethan just days before Halloween. Stephen appeared unusually upbeat during the transaction, a fact the agent never forgot. Prosecutors reminded the jury of Stephen's visit to a local chemical supply store,
where he had asked about purchasing cyanide. The clerk clearly remembered him and his irritation when told the smallest amount sold was £5. Stephen's defense team tried to sow doubt. They suggested it was possible an unknown neighbor had secretly tampered with the candy that night, pointing to the panic that had swept the community. They argued he was an unfortunate father caught in the middle of hysteria, and that the real culprit might never be found. But the defense crumbled under one undeniable fact. Not a single other child in Hawthorne Springs had received poisoned candy. Only the pixie sticks handed out by Stephen were contaminated. When asked to explain that coincidence while on the stand, Stephen calmly replied, "I don't know how it could have happened."
I don't know how it happened. His flat tone and absence of visible emotion stunned everyone in the courtroom. One juror later said that listening to Stephen Callahan testify felt like hearing someone recite memorized lines. After weeks of evidence and testimony, the jury needed just 46 minutes to reach a verdict, one of the shortest deliberations in Missouri history. Stephen Callahan was found guilty of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The judge formally sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Inside the courtroom, a muted wave of applause followed, an unusual reaction for such a setting. Several jurors were seen crying, not for Stephen, but for the suffering endured by Ethan Callahan. Stephen's wife, Clara, immediately filed for divorce and moved away with their daughter, Lydia, cutting all contact. She later told reporters she had never suspected her husband, believing him to be a devoted father until the truth came to light. Outside the courthouse, the prosecutor spoke bluntly to the press, declaring that Stephen had used his own child to stage a crime, a dark form of evil beyond comprehension. In the years that followed, Stephen's legal team filed appeal after appeal. Every single one was denied. He maintained his innocence, repeating his claim that an unknown stranger had poisoned the candy. Yet every reviewing court upheld the conviction, calling the evidence overwhelming and conclusive. While on death row, Stephen was described as a quiet, obedient inmate. He read scripture, organized prayer groups, and continued to insist he had been framed. Other prisoners reportedly avoided him entirely. Even men convicted of violent crimes found it difficult to reconcile someone who had murdered his own child. His execution was delayed multiple times due to legal challenges and procedural issues, but eventually no further appeals remained. In the early morning hours of March 31, 1984, nearly a decade after the crime, Stephen Callahan was executed by lethal injection at the Missouri State Penitentiary. Witnesses said he appeared calm and emotionless as he entered the chamber. Before the drugs were administered, he was allowed to speak. Reading from a prepared statement, he again proclaimed his innocence, said he forgave everyone, and claimed he held no bitterness, hoping his death would bring peace to those affected. For many listening, the words rang hollow. At 12:48 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. Minutes later, Stephen Callahan was pronounced dead. Outside the prison walls, nearly 300 people had gathered, some holding signs warning of Halloween dangers. They quietly observed the moment, aware of the cultural mark the case had left. Stephen Callahan's execution didn't merely close a criminal case, it reshaped a cultural tradition. After 1974, parents across the United States began inspecting Halloween candy before allowing their children to eat it. Police departments introduced free candy inspection programs nationwide. The legend of the Candyman instilled decades of fear about poisoned sweets and hidden dangers, a cautionary tale that persists even today. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the act itself, but the identity of the person responsible. The danger didn't come from a faceless stranger. It came from a father, trusted by his neighbors, his church, and his own family. Stephen Callahan didn't only kill his son, he shattered the innocence of an entire generation. Yet this was not the first time a quiet community had been shattered by an unthinkable crime. In the next case, the darkness deepens even further, a massacre born from a similarly chilling set of circumstances. This marked the moment when the horrifying truth behind the Keller family massacre finally emerged, one of the most disturbing and unforgettable cases ever documented.
The brutality involved went beyond murder. The victims were burned beyond recognition, a detail that made this case especially horrifying. What made it even more unsettling was the way it was uncovered, almost like something pulled from a horror film. Surviving family members reported seeing the shadows of the victims as if the dead themselves were revealing the truth. As unbelievable as it sounds, one question lingered. Was this a haunting, or did someone know more than they admitted? To understand how it began, we traveled to central Saskatchewan, a remote region between Saskatoon and Regina, a place defined by farmland, dirt roads, and isolation, the kind of place where secrets can remain buried for decades. On a bitterly cold morning, December 8, 2013, silence was shattered. Just after 7 a.m., volunteer firefighters raced across icy roads toward a blaze that would reveal horrors no one could have imagined. The house was fully engulfed, flames consuming it mercilessly. As firefighters approached, a disturbing sight froze them in place. A black Labrador lay motionless in the snow outside. The dog had not died from exposure. Its head bore signs of a brutal injury. Nearby, a red plastic gas can sat partially melted but still containing gasoline. It was immediately clear this fire had been deliberately set. Within 30 minutes, officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived. By then, the blaze was beyond control. Extreme cold made firefighting nearly impossible, and water could have destroyed evidence. Authorities allowed the house to burn, while police combed the surrounding area for clues. Near the dog, they found a 9mm shell casing, confirming the animal had been shot before the fire. When the fire finally burned out, investigators entered the charred remains. 3 bodies were discovered, confirming the violent end of a family that had once lived a quiet, private life. To understand the tragedy, we need to look at the family. Martin Keller had been married to Helen for 41 years. Martin was a respected farmer in the area, while Helen had worked at a local hospital. In 1971, they welcomed their first child, Laura. 2 years later, Monica was born. Tragedy struck in October 1973. Laura, just 2 years old, died in a farm accident. The loss drew the family closer. Soon after, their son Jason was born in 1975. Helen remained active in both the farm and her hospital work, while Martin continued farming full-time. Jason, the youngest, was known as the easygoing jokester. Monica, the second child, worked briefly at a law office before returning to help on the family farm. Neither married or had children, both living on the property into their 30s. Jason had a trailer on the farm, giving him independence while still remaining close to the main house. Then, on the morning of December 8, 2013, everything changed. A fire erupted at the Keller residence. A neighbor noticed smoke and called emergency services. By 7:15 a.m., firefighters called Jason with the devastating news. The family home was destroyed. When Jason arrived, he was overcome with grief. He reported that his parents, Martin and Helen, and his sister, Monica, were still inside. The presence of gasoline made investigators immediately suspicious. Forensic teams were called to examine the scene. The recovery of the victims was devastating. Martin, Helen, and Monica had all died in the blaze. Evidence of foul play, including the gas can and the bullet casing near the dog, confirmed that this was no ordinary house fire. It was a meticulously planned act of violence.
While Gordon and Monica's bodies were recovered, Helen Keller was never found. Investigators concluded she had likely been entirely consumed by the extreme heat of the fire. To compound the tragedy, another family dog, aside from the black Labrador found outside, was missing and presumed dead. The entire situation sent shockwaves through the small Saskatchewan community. This was clearly no accident. Did the family have enemies? Just 2 days later, on December 10, 2013, Jason Keller was brought in for questioning. Investigators asked if anyone might have wanted to harm the family. Still clearly in shock, he said he couldn't think of a single person. He did, however, offer one unusual detail. Jason mentioned a mounted white-tailed deer head that had been kept in the house. According to him, it was the only item of real value, and he suggested the murders might have been a robbery gone wrong. Jason claimed the trophy was worth $200,000, a figure many found difficult to believe, though he insisted it was accurate. Investigators quickly noted inconsistencies. The fire had destroyed nearly everything inside, so if the deer had been there, it likely would have burned. No signs of forced entry were found either. As the investigation progressed, Jason's behavior became increasingly erratic. His initial grief turned to visible anger and frustration. He accused the RCMP of moving too slowly and of not taking the case seriously. When informed that his mother's body had not been located, Jason reportedly erupted, accusing investigators of lying. Then came another alarming detail. Gordon's vehicle was missing. 3 days later, police located it across town. What raised eyebrows was that Jason appeared to know about the missing car before authorities announced it publicly. Even more concerning, police never told him about the 9mm shell casing found near the family dog, yet he somehow knew of that too. As word of the fire spread, Jason offered increasingly strange explanations for his knowledge. He began referencing ghosts, cold spots, and unexplained sensations, claiming he had received information from spirits about what happened that night. According to him, these apparitions revealed the identities of the victim's killer, but each time he told the story, details changed. In one account, he claimed he saw Monica as a ghost. In another, multiple spirits appeared, with Monica always present. He described them as angry, unsettled, and demanding justice. He said they told him everyone in the house had been shot before the fire started, that a 9mm handgun had been used, and that the murderer had thrown the weapon into a river afterward. Jason also provided a description of the killer, a man younger than himself, with a beard, a local resident, and known to the Keller family, allegedly struggling with mental health issues. He even floated the idea that the crime was committed by a hunter attempting to steal the supposedly valuable deer trophy. Despite the bizarre and changing accounts, Jason's ghost stories inadvertently directed police toward a local man, Josh Franks, a welder who had known Jason for years. Josh was questioned, but he denied involvement, passed a polygraph test, and no physical or circumstantial evidence linked him to the murders.
Meanwhile, suspicion increasingly fell on Jason himself. His erratic behavior, refusal to take a polygraph, and inconsistent stories raised serious red flags. When officers asked directly whether he had killed his family, his emotional reaction was notable but unconvincing. Investigators realized they still had far more work to do to untangle the truth behind the Keller family massacre.
Investigators, frustrated by Jason's conflicting stories and erratic behavior, decided to escalate the case using a controversial undercover strategy known as Mr. Big. The operation involved approaching Jason with an offer: participate in a criminal enterprise, store illegal items, and earn large sums of money. The hope was that under pressure or in developing trust, he would eventually reveal the truth about the murders. The operation began in April 2014, just 4 months after the fire. Jason, unaware that Mr. Big was actually an undercover officer, began spending time with the group in bars and clubs, believing he had made new friends in a dangerous, influential circle. He became involved in staged criminal activities, including simulated assaults and protection schemes, all carefully designed by law enforcement to convince him he was dealing with real criminals. Eager to belong and be accepted, Jason let his guard down. At one point, Mr. Big introduced a fabricated story. He claimed to have an uncle so terminally ill that he was willing to falsely confess to a triple murder he hadn't committed, ensuring that his granddaughter would receive financial compensation. The proposal was simple but manipulative. Jason was told that if he shared the truth about the Keller family murders, the uncle would take responsibility and the family would be compensated. Without fully considering the consequences, Jason confessed. He admitted that he had helped plan the murders, but insisted he hadn't pulled the trigger. He claimed the actual killings were carried out by Josh Franks, the same man previously cleared after passing a polygraph. Then Jason set up a meeting between Josh and Mr. Big, framing it as a harmless favor. He explained that the uncle was dying and the granddaughter needed money. Josh had no idea this meeting would become a turning point, eventually exposing the truth behind the brutal deaths of the Keller family. Jason later told investigators that it was crucial to explain everything from the beginning to avoid confusion. He began recounting events in December, the month when the plan was first conceived. According to Jason, he had been forging his father's signature on farm checks and attempting to buy cattle. He feared that once his deception was discovered, he would be cut off from the farm entirely. In his mind, there was only one way out. He described the planning of the murders in chilling detail and warned that anyone who backed out of the plan could be in danger, saying, "You never truly know." Jason admitted he didn't see it as a direct threat, but the possibility was always there. When asked about the night of the fire, he explained how he entered the house quietly, setting events in motion while maintaining a facade of normalcy, everything carefully orchestrated to ensure the plan succeeded. According to Josh, the sequence of events that night was methodical and brutal. He claimed he let the family dog out first, then entered Gordon and Sandra's bedroom, killing them. Afterward, he went to Monica's room to ensure no one survived. He even retraced his steps to shoot all 3 victims again, just to be certain. He explained he turned on the lights so he wouldn't miss. He didn't want anyone left alive by mistake. When asked if Monica had woken after the first shots, he said she never had a chance. Her firearm was broken, but he insisted he didn't want them to suffer or even realize what was happening. He admitted that in hindsight, the label animal fit him, though he denied it at the moment. Josh also described the fire. Jason had told him there was aviation fuel in the garage, which Josh used to set the blaze. He said he had to shoot the dog because it charged at him while he lit the flames. Reflecting later, he admitted that throwing the fuel directly into the house might have been more effective,
but at the time the truck was already running. After the fire was started, he retraced his steps to avoid leaving new tracks, drove off, met Jason, and was dropped off. That was how it ended. When questioned about the polygraph test he had previously passed, Josh admitted he had intentionally manipulated it. Sitting on the pressure pad, he subtly shifted his body during control questions, triggering false stress responses that threw off the results. No training, no outside help, he said. It was purely instinct. He also revealed he had used a torch lighter to start the fire and claimed he still had it in his truck. The tone shifted during questioning. Josh understood the interviewer's warning. No promises were being made, yet he spoke freely, believing that helping Jason's girlfriend would ultimately help him as well. When asked if he had ever killed anyone else, he answered casually, "No, never." His calmness, combined with his praise for his methods, was chilling in the context of triple homicide. It was at this point that the full weight of the situation became clear. Jason and Josh were completely ensnared. Months of lies, inconsistent stories, and bizarre claims had finally crumbled. Both men confessed to their roles in the triple murder, revealing the horrifying truth. Jason, under pressure, admitted that he had been forging checks and was on the verge of being exposed. The night before the murders, he and Josh had been drinking heavily and using drugs. What began as a plan to steal the mounted deer head and Gordon's truck spiraled into something far worse. Panic set in when someone awoke, and instead of fleeing, they made a series of horrific decisions. In the end, Jason and Josh were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. While nothing could bring back Gordon, Sandra, or Monica, justice was served. The judge acknowledged that parole could technically be considered after 25 years, but realistically, people convicted of multiple murders rarely walk free that soon. The haunting questions remain. Was Jason simply driven by greed and recklessness, or was there something darker at play in that household? And perhaps the most unsettling mystery of all, why was Sandra's body never found?
Security cameras later revealed the unsettling aftermath. Blood trickled across the train car floor, and stunned passengers scrambled to respond. Some tried to aid Irina immediately, applying pressure to her wound, while others called 911. Chaos erupted, but the attacker remained calm, blending into the crowd, disappearing as if the attack had been nothing more than a casual act of indifference. Irina, barely conscious and in shock, felt the world collapse around her. The pain was sudden, sharp, and terrifying, but even in those first moments, her instinct to survive kicked in. Fellow passengers worked together, lifting her carefully and shielding her from further harm as emergency responders raced to the station. By the time paramedics arrived, Irina's condition was critical. She was rushed to the nearest trauma center, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize her. Though she survived the attack, the physical and emotional scars were immense. Her neck wound left her with lifelong reminders of that night, while the randomness of the assault haunted her every step. Authorities initially struggled to identify the perpetrator. He had no prior connection to Irina, no visible motive, and had vanished into the city's sprawling transit system before witnesses could track him. Surveillance footage, combined with passenger accounts, became the cornerstone of the investigation. But even as law enforcement pieced together the attack, confusion only deepened. A GoFundMe page had been created in support of the attacker, not the victim. The brazenness of the act and the public's misdirected sympathies ignited widespread outrage. The case drew national attention, particularly after President Trump publicly referenced it. Investigators began exploring Irina's past, attempting to determine if the attack was random or targeted.
They examined her life in Charlotte, her Ukrainian roots, the trauma of fleeing her homeland, and her gradual rebuilding in the United States. Yet nothing suggested she was specifically at risk. She had lived quietly, worked diligently, and formed strong connections in her community. Her selection appeared entirely arbitrary, a chilling reminder of how random violence can strike anyone, anywhere. Friends and family described Irina as someone who radiated warmth and creativity. Her art, her kindness, her laughter, everything about her drew people in. That someone could attempt to snuff out that life for no discernible reason left those who knew her shaken. The attack forced her community to confront the unsettling truth. Danger can appear in everyday places, in moments we take for granted. Even a routine train ride home can turn into a nightmare without warning. As the investigation continued, authorities remained determined to bring the attacker to justice. While the motives remained unclear, one thing was certain. Irina Zarutska had survived a horrific act of violence, and the world was forced to reckon with the fragility of safety in public spaces. Her resilience, courage, and the quick actions of fellow passengers became a symbol of hope amid incomprehensible terror.
When asked whether she ever feared he might hurt someone, Brown's mother insisted no. He constantly spoke of being controlled by the police, claiming they dictated what he ate, when he walked, and even how he spoke. Violence toward others had never seemed likely to her until that night. Investigators quickly pieced together a chilling portrait. Brown, 34, had spent more than a decade cycling through the criminal justice system. His record included robbery, burglary, and felony theft, along with nearly 6 years in prison. Since his release in September 2020, his life had spiraled further. He moved between temporary shelters, lived intermittently on the streets, and repeatedly clashed with law enforcement. Court records showed arrests for assault, repeated misuse of emergency services, and alarming reports of delusions, claims that someone had poisoned him or was controlling his movements. Despite these warnings, the mental health system had failed to intervene effectively. Brown's schizophrenia, a severe and chronic mental illness, had gone largely untreated, leaving him untethered from reality. Friends and family tried to help, but the resources were insufficient, and on August 22, 2025, that failure culminated in tragedy. That evening, Irina Zarutsanka, a young woman who had fled the horrors of war in Ukraine, seeking safety in the United States, boarded the Blue Line train as she had countless times before. She never imagined that the calm, ordinary commute would become the site of unimaginable violence. Within moments, Brown attacked, stabbed her repeatedly in a sudden, deliberate act. Passengers described the scene as pure chaos. Screams filled the train car. Some rushed to aid Irina, others dialed 911, and a few fled in terror. Brown, disturbingly calm, did not attempt to flee. He simply removed his hoodie, pressed it to his own injuries, and walked away as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Irina had succumbed to her injuries, dying in the very city she had trusted to offer safety and refuge. The footage of the attack, captured by security cameras, would soon go viral,
sparking outrage and a national conversation about public safety, mental health, and the randomness of violence. Law enforcement acted swiftly. Brown was apprehended that night and charged with murder. His past, his untreated mental illness, and the sheer randomness of the attack added layers of complexity to the case. It wasn't just a crime, it was a warning about the fragility of safety, the consequences of systemic failures, and the need to protect vulnerable communities. Irena's story, while tragically cut short, became a symbol of both the dangers facing ordinary citizens and the resilience of a young woman who had survived so much already, only to be confronted by senseless violence in a place she thought was safe.
One photograph stood out above the rest. It showed a hand, barely visible, reaching toward the camera, fingers splayed in what could have been a desperate attempt for help, or a shadowy figure caught by chance. The image was grainy, barely in focus, and yet unnervingly clear. Something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators were left grasping at fragments of a story, trying to piece together the final hours of the two women. Search teams expanded their operations, deploying drones, helicopters, and trained trackers into the most treacherous parts of the jungle. Days turned into weeks, yet the wilderness revealed nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no evidence of anyone passing through except for the sporadic camera images. Each discovery seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. Local legends began to seep into the narrative. Guides spoke of hidden ravines, sudden floods, and wildlife that could incapacitate the unprepared. Some whispered of areas so dense and labyrinthine that even experienced locals avoided them, fearing they would become lost forever. Whether these tales were fact or folklore, investigators had to consider every possibility. The jungle itself seemed to resist explanation, swallowing the two women without leaving a trace. Meanwhile, online forums and social media became hotbeds of speculation. Amateur sleuths, armchair detectives, and concerned followers combed over every photograph, GPS coordinate, and report. Theories ranged from accidental falls into hidden ravines to encounters with unknown individuals or criminal activity. Some suggested human trafficking or kidnapping, citing the two men seen in the taxi as potential threats. Others leaned toward the natural hazards of the region, venomous creatures, sudden storms, or treacherous terrain. Despite these theories, one fact remained. The women had vanished without a trace. Every failed phone call, every eerie photograph, every unanswered question added to the growing sense of dread. Families pleaded for information, while international authorities coordinated search efforts across borders. The $30,000 reward offered by Dutch investors remained unclaimed, further frustrating hope for breakthroughs. By the end of April, the trail had gone cold. Chris Kramers and Lizanne Fruins were officially listed as missing, their disappearance a haunting reminder of nature's unpredictability and the lingering darkness that can lurk even in paradise. The jungle had erased them almost completely, leaving only fragments, a handful of photographs, failed emergency calls, and the memories of those who last saw them smiling in sunlight. Even now, more than a decade later, the case remains unresolved. What truly happened after that final photograph?
Did they fall victim to the unforgiving wilderness, or did something far more sinister intervene? Every answer remains tantalizingly out of reach, leaving only questions and the persistent echo of 2 lives lost too soon. Riverbank. How had it appeared so neatly packed, untouched by the jungle's heavy rains, weeks after the disappearance? Why were Chris's bones unusually white and chemically altered, while Lizanne's still retained traces of skin? These anomalies suggested that something about their deaths, or at least the handling of their remains, did not align with the official narrative of a simple hiking accident. Speculation grew online and among investigative circles. Some theorized that the women might have encountered someone or something while deep in the jungle, someone capable of staging the scene. Others considered the possibility of natural forces combined with human interference, perhaps scavengers or even local criminals exploiting the remoteness of the trail. Then there was photo number 509, still missing from Lizanne's camera. Its absence remained a haunting question. Had it captured the very moment something went horribly wrong, only to vanish intentionally? Every recovered photograph, every partial remains, only added layers of unease. Despite months of forensic analysis, Panamanian authorities could not identify any clear cause of death. No trauma consistent with an attack was found, no evidence of weapons, and no signs of struggle beyond the natural difficulties of navigating the dense jungle. Yet the inconsistencies, the pristine backpack, the chemical-like bleaching, the missing photo kept the case alive in the public imagination. Ultimately, the official conclusion of accidental death provided closure on paper, but the families, investigators, and the public were left with lingering questions. What truly happened in the El Pianista jungle that April afternoon? Were Chris and Lizanne's final hours a product of misfortune and nature's cruelty, or was there a darker hand at work in the shadows of the rainforest? Even today, the story of Chris Kamers and Lizanne Froon stands as a chilling reminder that some mysteries never fully resolve, leaving only fragments, photographs, and the silence of the jungle to tell a story that refuses to be forgotten.